Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
This week, we're very happy to welcome Bryan Jones. Bryan describes himself on the About page of his website as a retinal neuroscientist, photographer, and advocate for specialized knowledge. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
I have to say that when I saw that retinal neuroscientist, that just tickled an itch inside me because I don't do science or medicine, but I'm really curious, and I'll explain why in a second particularly. But that idea of neuroscience and vision is something that's always fascinated me, probably since when I was a teenager. I got a book of M.C. Escher drawings, and then when Hofstadter's book Gödel, Escher, Bach came out, that sort of stuff changed my life back then. And of course, I took a different path. But looking into that with photography is extremely interesting. So here's why I'm particularly interested in talking about how we see versus how the camera sees. I have amblyopia. So I don't have stereo vision. I have no depth perception. So unlike most people, I see what the camera sees.
Right.
And that, I wonder if that means that when I'm taking pictures, composing photos, I'm more able to pre-visualize what the camera is going to see.
That may be. That's actually kind of interesting because, what a camera does. So this is kind of interesting because, we think of our eyes as cameras. And there's a lot of, talk about how similar they are. And from an optical standpoint, that's true, right? We have, so at the very front of the eye, you have this transparent piece of tissue called the cornea, and that actually does a lot of correction. In fact, in a lot of people, when you do like vision correction surgery, right, radiokeratotomy, LASIK, that sort of thing, you're actually operating on that cornea, that thin layer of transparent tissue, to reshape it so that the image focuses properly on the back of your retina. And then behind that, you have a lens, right? And you have your iris sort of around that, and that functions as the aperture. You can sort of think of it as the aperture. Well, it is an aperture. And so the correlation between that and a camera is pretty precise. And then you've got the retina at the back of your eye, which is your imaging sensor, right, of sorts.
Or your film.
Yeah, your film. But the weird thing is, the retina is like, it's not just a sensor, it's a little compute device, right? It's a highly parallel computing device that's actually built backwards from how you think it might be built, right? So the actual photoreceptors themselves, the sensors themselves, the specialized neurons, are at the back of the retina. And the retina is sort of transparent, and so photons have to pass through the retina to get all the way to the back to the photoreceptors before they detect them, and then pass that information forward through this sort of circuitry. And the circuitry does things like, calculates luminance, light going up, light going down, absolute luminance, contrast between patches of light.
So it's kind of adjusting the highlights and shadows, the exposure?
Absolutely. The exposure, highlights and shadows, detail, velocity. It makes velocity calculations, angle, direction, and basically calculates a bunch of primitives before sending that information onto your brain for further processing. And the amblyopia part, that occurs in brain when your brain is comparing the inputs between the retina on your right versus the retina on your left, right? So it effectively calculates a sort of parallax, typically, and that can clearly go awry in a lot of folks. But what we see on a camera sensor is sort of a flattened projected image, right? And so we don't, unless you're shooting with a rangefinder like a Leica, you don't appreciate that parallax when you're trying to focus. And so what a lot of amblyopes typically do when they're trying to sort of judge depth is that they sort of inherently range by parallax, right? And you can see this in a lot of creatures. Like if you look at octopus, octopus are not, They don't have binocular vision. And so what they'll do is you'll see their eye, and they have this very sophisticated eye that's actually built differently from ours. The photoreceptors are in the front. But what they'll do is they'll look at something, and then they'll bob their head up and down, right? And do a range calculation. And you'll actually see that in people too, so like
Because we can see the movement of the layers. Like I'm looking at the lamp on my desktop, and if I move my head up, I can see the speaker behind it
right.
moving, and that gives me an idea, an estimate of the distance between the two.
Right. And so typically when you see a photographer, right, and the camera's up to their face and their eyes in the camera, they will do the same thing, right? Because they have lost now depth perception because they have this projected image coming through the camera. And so you'll see a photographer and their face is up to the camera, and then they'll move like left and right or up and down, right? And get that sort of range by parallax because they've lost now depth perception in the camera.
Is that why so many photographers crouch down? The photographers crouch, that must lead to back problems over time.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Yeah, especially carrying lots of heavy gear.
Yes. We were talking before the show about all the heavy gear and how you've gone into simplicity. We'll get to your cameras in a little bit.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is it's almost as if we don't think about how the eye works. We think that the camera is the same as the eye, but obviously it's extremely different. For one thing, the eye is actually showing things upside down and the brain is flipping it the right way, and the camera's not doing that. But is it, by better understanding the eye, how can that help us in photography? How can it help? How can we apply the understanding of the way we see to the way the camera sees? Because it is a translation.
Mm-hmm. It is. And so, I don't know. So this is actually kind of tough because people have been studying the eye for as long as there have been humans, right? It's, you can go back and look through Egyptian literature and Mesopotamian literature, and there's all these references, to the eye and the window to the soul and this sort of thing. But people didn't really start studying the neuroscience of the retina until about 150, 130 years ago. And
that's not that long after the camera was developed.
Precisely, yeah. And so there's sort of this parallel track between wanting to understand how we see the world and wanting to document the world and preserve the world. And the biggest difference actually between retinas and cameras is that the camera allows us to capture a moment in time, right? Going through Cartier-Bresson's, work, it's a
decisive moment, yeah.
Decisive moment, right? But the retina, you can actually do. There's some tricks that you can do, and if you fixate your vision on a single point and don't move your eye and try really hard not to move your eye, the world starts fading away, and it fades to gray, right? Because the retina the way the retina is wired is it depends upon an image dancing over the surface of the retina, constantly changing. And that's true because even if you hold your head very still, because you've got these microsaccades, your eyes are constantly sort of jittering, and your brain edits all of that out. You've got cardiac impulse, you've got blood vessels in your eye and your retina, and every time your heart beats, that sort of shakes the imaging surface a little bit, and your brain edits that out too.
So it's got built-in image stabilization.
It's got built-in image stabilization. It's also got a system that this gets a little weird in that the visual system is sort of this amazing sort of educator on how we're basically synthesizing our reality moment by moment by moment. And so our brain lives in this black box. And our brain can only understand what's going on in the outside world by the sensory systems that feed into it. And so our sensory systems are not perfect. And so what our brain does is it takes this afferent information, the streaming information that's coming into the brain, and it tries to make sense of it. And where there's gaps in information, it fills in the gaps. So the classic sort of example is a baseball pitcher and trying to hit a baseball. And the fastest pitchers can pitch so fast that your brain actually cannot see the ball for the entire trajectory from the pitcher's mound to where you're going to hit it. It's not biologically possible for those circuits to hit your retina, for your retina to send that information to your brain to process that, and then give feedback to your conscious system and then to the motor control circuits that control your eyes and everything. So what your brain does is creates a model of where it thinks that ball is going to go from the very first information that comes in. And this is why, screwballs work. This is why, the different kinds of pitches that are intended to sort of deceive the batter work, because the ball in its path breaks the model of what the batter thinks the path is going to be. And so, in effect, what your brain is doing is it's synthesizing its own reality. And so from that sense, yeah, we're kind of living in a hologram, if you will. But our hearing does that, our vision system does that, our mechanosensation system does that, our temperature systems do that, and so vision is kind of this sort of hallucination, if you will, that's generated moment by moment by moment.
I can't help but think that this sounds a lot like computational photography, and how all that pre-processing and post-processing, and how you end up with an image, but it's a massively edited, assembled, put together image. And I mean, I don't want to make everything we say become an analogy of this is how it works in a camera and this is how our brain works, but I personally have never heard that kind of a description of how eyesight works that makes it a lot more involved and a lot more of that processing to get to a certain point.
I also want to say that it makes it sound like we're living in the Matrix.
Right.
We are.
We kind of are.
We are in many ways. But getting to Jeff's point about the computational photography, how much of that developed from the kind of work you do, the neuroscientific stuff? Is that where they started, or is that sort of a parallel line that they took, looking at how the eye works and the brain works, and figured out that there are ways to do that in a camera or in a phone in this case?
So I think it's parallel. Well, it is parallel in a lot of ways, in that the technology that we've had for photography is actually pretty limited. In terms of, in the early days, it was film sensitivity, and it was getting enough photons actually through, the first sort of lenses onto a big, sort of wet collodion imaging plate. And they had to, add lots of additional photons, with chemical flashes in the early days. And there's actually some interesting discussion there on sort of that plays into sort of structural racism, right? Some of the early photographic technologies in New Zealand culture, because of the flash and the chemicals involved, the tattoos weren't rendered on the final image.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen some pictures recently that process the colors differently to bring that out.
Exactly. And so the photography itself has sort of been this an attempt to sort of duplicate what we think the visual system is capable of, but the technology's held us back for a long, long time. The advantages that the technology has had has sort of been calculus in one sense, in that we can do longer term sort of integrations of photos to do star trails and things like that humans can't see. But the human visual system, the dynamic range in the human visual system is far wider than photography can allow. And what computational photography is now starting to do is bridge that, right? So your visual system, the way your retinas are constructed, you have rod photoreceptors and you have cone photoreceptors. And the rod photoreceptors are designed to work at very, very low light levels, right?
So they're the high ISO receptors.
They are the high ISO receptors, right? And they're the photoreceptors that you're using on anything, more dim than moonlight, like half a moon. And they only see black and white.
So we do have monochrome sensors. That's
We
good
do.
to know.
We absolutely do. Yeah. And there's this really cool circuit in the retina. So mammalians, us, we re-evolved vision. So at the end of the Jurassic, mammalians lost a lot of our visual pathways, and we redeveloped this rod pathway on top of the much older evolutionary cone pathway, right? So if you look at a lot of older organisms, reptiles, amphibians, birds, they all have cone-dominated systems. And so the rods were piggybacked on top of the system. And so what the rods do is there's a circuit that comes through the retina from the rods to the rod bipolar cells to the cell called an A2 amacrine cell. And the A2 amacrine cell is sort of a crossover cell that takes rod circuitry and couples it into the older cone circuitry. And what that allowed mammalians to do was function at really low light levels and then function at really high bright light levels, right? And so the interesting sort of trick is that if you go out on like a half moon night, right, or a 3/4 moon night, there's no color in the world, right?
And that's the expression, "At night, all cats are gray."
Yeah, exactly. And so it's only your rod photoreceptors that are working. And so when a moon is bright and full, you can start to see color in the world. That color exists, right? But your sensory system is just not capable of seeing it until the luminance comes up to a point where your cone photoreceptors start to work. And at that point, the rod photoreceptors actually shut off.
Yet we don't have fast enough apertures in our eyes to see, like, say, cats can see at night.
Yeah, so cats actually have this cool additional feature that's sort of like an image amplifier, right? There's a structure at the back of lots of animals' eyes, cats, cows, dogs, called a tapetum lucidum, and it's a layer of guanine crystals, and what they do is they act as a reflector. So the photons come through the retina, come through the photoreceptors, bounce off this mirror at the back of the eye, back into the photoreceptors, and it's effectively an image amplifier.
So that's why sometimes when I take photos of my cats and it's somewhat dark and there's a light on someplace, their eyes shine.
Right. Yeah. Same with cows. Same with foxes. Other.
Never done it with cows, but I did get one photo of one of my cats sitting on a bedside table right next to a charger, and his eyes were all green because of that, and it looked like he was being charged by the charger.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of a cool image amplifier. The downside of that is that it degrades the visual quality a little bit because the photons are bouncing around and they're not as precisely focused on the same point.
Yet my cats catch mice at night.
Yeah.
I live next to a farm and they just go crazy at night.
Yeah. So cats are using vision. Cats are also using vibration
and sound. Yeah.
Sound.
Yeah.
So the world that they live in is a very different world.
Yeah.
They're sort of perceptual degrees of freedom.
So, okay, this is really technical, but now I want to get it a little bit more concrete. What focal length is our eyes?
Oh, gosh.
I know that there are a lot of people who say different things. Some people say it's like 35 millimeters. Some say it's like 50. Some say it's like 40. But what I find interesting is that What used to be the sort of standard first lens that someone would get with a film camera was a 50 millimeter lens. And it was
Right.
more or less what we would see in the real world,
Right.
because I guess the idea of a camera then was to capture what you see. And then, if you look at little Instamatic cameras, it was a wider angle lens because you get more depth of field, and you're more likely to want to get a group of people, and then you're not going to be too far away, et cetera. But let's assume our eyes are a 50 millimeter focal length. What happens in a photographer's mind when they switch to a lens, when you're out walking around, shooting whatever, and you're seeing the world in 50 millimeters, and all of a sudden you pick up your camera and it's got a 100 millimeter lens?
Yeah.
Does the brain perceive this in some special way, or is it just looking like it's bigger?
So there's a couple of things going on here. One is, yeah, so the very first lens I bought for my first film camera was a 50 millimeter lens. And that's how I thought I saw the world for a long time. And then I tried a 35 millimeter lens, and it's like, this is how everybody sees the world, right? This is sort of a natural view for me. The neuroscience is a little different, right? So our eyes actually see a much wider field of view, right? Our eyes almost have like a fisheye view, from almost like 180 degrees, so if you hold your hands, at the sides of your heads and you start pushing them forward to the point where you can see them, that's probably 168, 170 degrees, right in there. And we can see that, right? But we don't typically pay attention to the information out there, right?
Well, not only that, but it's not as clear, is it?
No, it's not. So we have a structure in our retina called the fovea. And the fovea is an area of very dense cone photoreceptors, and that is represented on our brain with a relatively large area. So that means that we've dedicated a lot of brain circuitry to understanding and perceiving this very narrow sort of 3-degree range at the center of our attention.
And as you mentioned earlier, the eye's constantly moving around to expand the coverage of that little space.
Right. And so most of what we pay attention to is this sort of central few degrees of vision. That's what we use to read with. That's what we use to sort of drive with. That's what we sort of use for most of the things in our lives, this sort of very restricted field of vision. And so typically when we look through a camera, we're utilizing that very few degrees that we sort of attend to in most of our everyday life, and so that can lead to some varied perceptions, right? So I remember once I was flying from Los Angeles to Auckland, New Zealand, and there was a full moon that came up over the wing of the plane, and I said to myself, that is the biggest moon I've ever seen in my entire life, right? It was huge. It was massive. And it almost did not seem real. It was so big. And I pulled out a camera. I had this little point and shoot Canon power shot. And I managed to stabilize the camera in the window enough and get a photo of this. And I look at the picture in the camera, and it's nothing, man. I mean, it's just, and it was like, this is not real. This is not what I'm seeing, right? This is not a faithful reproduction of what my sensory system is actually documenting. And so the reality was the moon wasn't any bigger because we're, 40,000 feet up over the Pacific. It was the only thing in the sky, and what I was attending to, it seemed big, right? But the reality is the image that the moon subtends, if you sort of draw out the distance on the moon and calculate how much space it occupies on the back of your retina using sort of standard optics calculations, it was no bigger. But my perception was that it was bigger.
That happens a lot here in Seattle. We have Mount Rainier, which is visible. And there are sometimes, like driving down I-5, you'll come around a corner and it just looks huge. And part of it is the framing among, the hills and buildings and things like that. And you're like wow, first of all, it's a very common thing to say, oh, the mountain is out if it's clear. And so, there's Mount Rainier. Woo, it's amazing, it's beautiful. And then you drive a little bit further and maybe the road curves again. And even though you've gotten closer to it, then you look at it again and it just looks smaller. It's this really weird optical illusion. So.
And there's also the illusion when you're driving toward a mountain, it doesn't look like you're getting any closer until you get really close. I lived in the Alps for a dozen years, and we would often have that. You'd be going down a valley, and it would look like it was far away, and then all of a sudden, it would seem closer.
Yeah, yeah.
You said you see a 35 millimeter focal length. Does everyone see a 35 millimeter focal length? Because I don't think I do.
No, I think, so sort of the biology is everybody sees, 160 degree focal length, right? Their field of view is actually really broad. We just don't spend a whole lot of time paying attention to what's out here unless something starts moving very fast, or there's a contrast thing, or there's something moving in our periphery, right? That then signals our brain to say, hey, pay attention because there's something over here, right?
But I'm not speaking about field of view, because there's two ways you can talk about lenses. One is the field of view, so the angle of view that the lens covers.
Correct.
But the other is the relative size of things. So I'm looking at my iMac. If I'm looking through a lens, a wide angle lens, it'll seem smaller. If I'm looking through a telephoto, it'll seem larger.
Right. So part of that is the optical calculations that you're projecting through the lens onto the imaging sensor. So there is going to be some magnification, with a 100 or a 135 millimeter or a 200 millimeter lens versus a 35 millimeter lens. And so you're sort of trying to fit the world outside that's visible through that frame onto the imaging sensor. And, figuring out, what humans actually see in, what our f-stop is, we're probably, I don't know, depending upon how old we are, we probably go from f1.6 to, if we're young and have perfect vision, probably around 0.9, but the actual focal length isn't a really good correlate, because like I said, there's that area of attention in our fovea that only on our retina occupies a few degrees, but to us, we fill the whole world with that, right? So when we use a 35 millimeter lens or a 50 millimeter lens or a 200 millimeter lens, our whole world ends up filling that viewfinder. And then what we do when we're using a longer focal length lens is we end up sort of panning around more, right, to try and sort of fit it in. Or we use that lens to sort of collapse the distances,
Right.
to get other technical effects that we want to do. Like,
Right.
You've seen the pictures of the full moon and the people standing on top of the mountains, made with like a 2,000 millimeter lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To sort of collapse that distance. So I don't know. That's actually kind of a tough question to me. Is what focal length is our eyes?
So basically what I'm taking away from this is we simply can't compare our eyes to a camera. In some ways, the whole idea of a lens and an aperture and a sensor, that we can, but in terms of focal length, it's a different story. If we were to look through, if I were to take a piece of cardboard and cut out a frame or just look through my fingers,
Mm-hmm.
I would see less of the world like I would in a picture.
Right.
But it's not, and my eyes are the same.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what we typically do, we live in a dynamic world, right? And so if something is 180 or 190 degrees behind us, there are other sensory cues, and we'll just turn our head, right? And what we end up doing when we have these microsaccades, when the image is sort of shifting around, or we attend to something different, or we shift our gaze, or we turn our heads, our brain basically ends up synthesizing a larger world for us. And this gets back to Jeff's comment on computational photography. So, you know, what the computational photography techniques are doing is they're taking a wider variety of exposures, and they're condensing them into, you know, what we used to call sort of high dynamic range photography, right? And then they're doing other things, you know, like eliminating motion blur, and some of the computational photography techniques in phones are actually pretty impressive now. And so in a sense, what your brain and what your retina are doing is sort of computationally fusing information to give us a different perception of the world. And there are things that we can do to actually modify that, right? So you made the comment earlier that, you know, the image of the world is actually upside down on our retinas.
Yeah.
Your brain understands this, right, and makes that conversion for you. But there were some experiments back in the 60s where you can put a pair of glasses on with a prism that flips the world upside down. And so as long as you wear these glasses, everything looks upside down to you. And, you know, you walk around for a couple of days and you bump into things and you can't pick anything up and you're knocking glasses over. And then you wake up one morning and the world is back. And your brain has flipped the world again to make it
It's adapted
match.
to the glasses.
It's adapted to the glasses, right? So
Yeah.
there's this plasticity in our visual system, in our brains, that fixes a lot of that stuff. And so when we have, you know, disease or trauma in our eyes, it's not uncommon, for instance, for people to have visual deficits in their retinas. They lose areas of vision. And what their brain slowly over time does is it fills these gaps in. And they're actually, it happens so slowly, and your brain is so good at sort of creating this illusion that they're actually not aware of it, right? And so this is why annual vision checkups are so important.
I have floaters in my eyes, and when one moves or a new one shows up, it's like I can't see anything but that. And then after a few days, I don't see it anymore because the brain has just figured out how to filter it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, with all of this in mind, you as a photographer, when you go out to shoot, is any of this top of mind, or do you just internalize? Like how, as a photographer, does all of this knowledge affect what you shoot and how you shoot?
I think it's evolved over time, right? I mean, the early days of photography for me, it was film, and you know, there was a lot of time spent just trying to sort of understand the tools, right? And I was a photographer before I was a neuroscientist. So, you know, you're like, okay, how many degrees of freedom are we dealing with, right? There's film sensitivity, you know, there's shutter speed, and there's aperture. And that's basically it, right? And you can fit, you know, the entire world of photography into those three variables. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to figure that out. And the neuroscience started sort of trickling in a little bit. And the interesting thing was when I started shooting black and white digital only, that forced me to start thinking about luminance and light independent of color. I think for a long time for me, I struggled with color. And I struggled with framing, and I was looking for form, and the color ended up confusing me a lot. Mm-hmm. And so being forced into a paradigm where I was only shooting black and white sort of brought me back to the black and white film days, and sort of got me to sort of start seeing light in terms of luminance and form again, without the distraction of color. And then, so when you start shooting color again, you know, it's like you sort of learn those lessons along.
When you started shooting black and white digital, were you shooting on a camera with a live view, or were you using a Leica where you were just seeing the rangefinder, and so you were still composing in color but getting your pictures later in black and white?
Yeah, so I was using the monochrome, So we were joking about that earlier. When the Leica monochrome first came out, my friend Trent and I was making fun of it. It didn't make any sense to me, right? Why would you spend extra money on a camera that could only see black and white when you can just make a black and white conversion of any, because it's a digital image, right? Who cares? It turns out I was wrong. I was really, really wrong. And the sensitivity of the black and white sensor and the precision of the imaging and the resolution, when you throw away the bare chip, the interpolation from the red, green, blue pixels,
the 3-color filters,
was just glorious. And that was a digital camera, so I could at least get, in the black and white film days, right? You'd capture the image, and there was this delay of days to weeks before you developed your film to actually get that feedback loop going. The monochrome was a digital. They've come out with a more recent, Leica came out with a camera, the 262, that didn't have a digital a screen on the back, right?
Right.
But the monochrome does. So you're able to sort of get a more immediate feedback.
Yeah, but not through the viewfinder.
Right.
Because it's a rangefinder viewfinder. So you could use it like a film camera and see the world in color and still shoot in black and white.
Correct.
If you're looking at the LCD, then you can get the black and white.
I see your point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it sort of forces you. So the best photographers, I think, if you read, a lot of photographers' biographies and things like that. Ansel Adams was a big advocate of this sort of pre-visualizing your image, right? That was another sort of lesson to me in pre-visualization, right? You're looking at the world through an optical viewfinder, and you're imagining what it would be like when you actually click the shutter. And so shooting black and white helped with that. From a neuroscience perspective, I think that has informed my sort of understanding of shooting at varying light levels. So at the very low light levels and at the very bright light levels, you can you understand what's happening in the human visual system. And I think with a lot of folks, there is that period of confusion when, they see something in their eye and they're trying to duplicate it on the film, and they don't quite know how, because there's a technological and there's a sensory disconnect. And so once you sort of understand that, then it makes it a little easier for you to sort of pre-visualize the image that you want to occur on the sensor.
From a neuroscientific point of view, when we approach a photo, it's a simulacrum of an event, a moment in time. When we look at a black and white photo, which is an alteration of that moment in time, do we process that image differently because of the lack of color?
I would argue we do, right? It removes the distractions of color. Humans are, even the colorblind among us, are driven by gradations in brightness and hue and color. The colorblind still see color, right? They just see a restricted range of color, 2 colors versus 3 colors. And there's actually some good evidence that some females are tetrachromatic, right? So there's a gene. So there's a gene duplication in those women that occurs on the X chromosome. And because they have 2 X chromosomes, they have 2 opportunities for a mutation to occur. And if that happens, then the dynamic range of that color space that they can see is actually expanded relative to a trichromat. And so that becomes really important to us. And some colors are more important than others. If you go into the animal kingdom and you see red on an animal in the forest, that's generally bad, right? And some animals use that as a form of warning.
And green is a sort of a camouflage color.
And green can be a camouflage color, and blue can be, so blue is rare in the animal world. But among some birds, you see these just unbelievable bird of paradise, right, where they've got these blue patterns and these flashes of blue, and they can use that as signaling because that attracts attention, that stands out in the world. And so black and white photography sort of throws all that out, and you're just using luminance and contrast and gradations.
And shapes.
And shapes, yeah.
Just to mention two photographers who I like a lot. Michael Kenna, who we interviewed on the podcast, he told me that he doesn't use color because he likes not having that distraction of the color.
Right.
He likes focusing on the shapes. And at the opposite, I saw a documentary about William Eggleston where he was talking about how he looks at his photos upside down to see if they still work because he's more interested in both the colors and the shapes.
Yeah. No, and that's the beauty of art, right? Is that, we used to do, sort of years before the pandemic, but, when photo walks were really popular, we used to have a photo walk series where, we'd use social media, the early days of Twitter, and we'd announce a photo walk, and sometimes a dozen people would show up, and sometimes 200 people would show up. And the fun part of photo walks for me was that you'd walk through the same environment with, 5 people, a dozen people, 100 people. And then everybody'd upload those photos at the end of the day, and you'd get to see what somebody else saw in that same environment. And that was a lot of fun. We actually did a photo walk of my the place where I work, the Moran Eye Center, here at the University of Utah, and we had 50 people come through and photograph the environment, the lab space and clinical space and atrium. And I've worked here, almost every day for, a couple of decades now. And I saw new things through other people's eyes that I had never paid attention to or I had never seen before. And so to me, that's sort of the beauty of photography and the beauty of art is that you get to see what somebody else attends to and pays attention to.
So one last comment, and this is pure neuroscience. This is pure perception. I find that if I'm looking, I have a lot of photo books. I have hundreds of photo books. I'm a photo book collector. And I find that if I'm looking at stuff by a particular photographer a lot, and then I go out, I see the kinds of things that they're looking at. Like if I go through a bunch of William Eggleston books, I see the world like William Eggleston. Yeah. And I'm taking pictures of that sort of stuff. It's like it's imprinting a vision. It's imprinting someone else's vision in my mind and telling my mind that I can look for that kind of thing.
What are your favorite photo books?
A lot of Eggleston, particularly the Los Alamos, Los Alamos Revisited. Yeah. I love Michael Kenna's work, particularly stuff in Japan. Yeah. Joel Meyerowitz, both his street photography and then when he went up to Cape Cod and he did these things with the big 8x10 camera and he's doing the open space and the gradations of light in twilight and things like that.
So it's been interesting that sort of the books and what you sort of attend to, you're absolutely right. You start seeing things the way that photographer sees things through those books. And that's why they're so wonderful, is that you can sort of take these journeys and then when you go to someplace, it's kind of fun to see if you can, duplicate that photo that they made.
Not even duplicate the photo they made, but duplicate the mindset that framed the world in the way they did. That's the way I think of it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to sort of, fit yourself into that sensory space, that neurosensory space that, and, it's hard sometimes because...
The same way, let's say, if you play piano, you want to adopt the phrasing of Bill Evans or Thelonious Monk, that kind of thing.
Right. And then the true mastery is when you start taking all of those information, all of those data, and start synthesizing your own reality and your own sort of view of the world. And that's where style comes from, right? And so when you see, a particular photograph by a particular photographer that's made that their style, you're like, oh, that's shot by so and so, and this one is clearly shot by so and so, because it becomes their style.
Yep. Okay, Bryan Jones, this has been fascinating. I could talk about this for hours, but I think our listeners are probably getting bored by now. Thank you so much for joining us. There'll be a link to your website, your Instagram, where you don't seem to post very much, Flickr, where you seem to have more photos, including cat photos. Bryan, thanks.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Bryan.
Okay, Jeff, time for our snapshots. What have you got?
Well, today I'm going to go away from photography and talk about my other love, which is coffee.
I laugh because you take more pictures of coffee cups than I take of cats.
Wow, I guess that's probably true. It seems like I haven't taken pictures of coffee lately, but I guess I have. It's a constant. So I use the service to get beans called Yes Please Weekly, and that's Yes PLZ. It's basically a mail service, and every month they send me a bag of coffee. And unlike some coffee services where you can specify, like, I want, this specific roaster and this specific blend, this one is just put together by the folks behind this. And they've consistently had really good coffee. And it's different every week, but it's sort of more of a lighter roast, more of a fruitier profile, which I tend to like anyway. So, yes, coffee that comes to you from Yes Please, that's mine.
And you don't even have to go out and pick it up.
And I don't even have to go out and pick it up. It just arrives in the mailbox. And it's affordable. I've used a few different services, and some of them are great, but it can really add up. And in this case, I should probably disclose, my wife works for Starbucks, and so most of the coffee is from Starbucks because part of her benefit is you get free coffee. And so, I mean, not at any time, but you have a certain allotment that you can use. And so that's mostly what we drink. And Starbucks coffee is fine. It's perfectly fine. And then I have this come once a month that, gives me my nice fruity coffee. So, Kirk, what do you have this week?
I've got a book. Let me see if I can pick it up here.
Oh, my goodness. Don't hurt yourself. You're going to throw out your back.
It's called Spirit Stones, The Ancient Art of the Scholar's Rock.
Oh.
The photographer's name is Jonathan M. Singer. Now, I had never heard of him before. I'm not going to open the book to show you because it's too heavy. The Scholar's Rock, or the Gongshu in Chinese, is the Chinese people decided that rocks are beautiful, and they decided to take specific types of rocks, and there are classifications for the different aesthetics they look for into rocks. And they've made them into works of art, and they mount them on little wooden stands. There's a relationship with bonsai in some ways. And I heard about this not long ago. I know someone in Germany who built a Japanese garden. It's about 6,000 square meters. It's about an acre and a half. And he was talking about this. He was telling me, this is the original art form, that someone would take a rock and pick it up and say, this is art, this is beautiful. And it's very interesting. I find the concept very interesting as an art form. What's really beautiful about this book is this is about 300 pages long, and it's got photos of a variety of these things, each one mostly full page, all black and white, which there's pros and cons, because some of these rocks are colored, so you're losing out on that. But by black and white, they have a sort of a constancy across the different images. And these are photos of works of art taken in such a perfect way that highlights the works of art so much. Now, this photographer, I'll put a link in the show notes to a webpage at Abbeville Press, which has published his books. Before this, he did a book called Fine Bonsai, Art and Nature, and it was very similar, photos of really collectible bonsais, the expensive ones. And before that, Botanica Magnifica, Portraits of the World's Most Extraordinary Flowers and Plants. All three of, I haven't seen the other books, but I've seen some of the photos from inside. All three of these are examples of photography as pure representation, yet done with perfect lighting and perfect exposure, so you can really get into the objects that are in there.
Oh.
They're expensive books. This one was actually only about £42 on Amazon, but the list price is something like $95 in the US. The other ones are more expensive. All three of them are very large books, very heavy, 400 pages. It's an interesting concept of photography meant to highlight a specific type of object.
Very nice.
And to highlight the beauty of these objects. Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.